Good evening, everyone. Today we're going to talk about educational psychology versus school psychology. We're going to discuss how they are similar and how they are different. First, let's talk about their similarities. To be honest, most of the similarity ends with their overarching goal, which is to help children in the learning environment, but also the history of how each of them began. During the time period of 1890 to 1920, America went through an era of reform. The era of reform is defined by four different areas. One would be social reform, next is immigrants, industrialization, and then World War I. For social reform, children were no longer seen as labor, but as something to be loved and cherished. They were also seen as the saviors of society, and therefore compulsory schooling was necessary as it was a systematic approach to teaching children about the morals and values and standards of American society. Because of the influx of immigrants at this time, America was afraid of losing these values and morals, and they needed to make sure that there was an educated future, that these children would grow up to have the same values and morals instilled in American children. Also, there was an increase in science and technology, and because of this, more scientists were needed in order for us to keep up with the other world powers. Next, that leads us into World War I, where alpha and beta tests were used by the military, and although they weren't the information needed as originally discussed, they became standardized for Americans and therefore used in schools on children. Next, let's talk about how they are different. Educational psychology deals more with the macro and the system as a whole, whereas school psychology deals more in the micro view and more of an individualistic system. The research topics for educational psychology include cognition, motivation, measurement, individual differences, academic problems, cognitive processing, and teaching and learning. Whereas in school psychology, it's assessment, consultation, referrals, crisis intervention and prevention, developmental, clinical, educational foundation, and they often use single subject design. Next, let's look at these two systems individually. Educational psychology. Educational psychology deals with cognition and how students as a whole learn. Mitchell and McConnell wrote an article for the Contemporary Educational Psychology Journal and discussed each of these topics. Cognition was inclusive of academic performance and achievement, creativity, gender differences, motivation, self-efficacy, and test anxiety. Motivation was the next topic discussed, and how students could be motivated either intrinsically or externally. Measurement is also a research interest for educational psychologists, often because they want to see how the students as a whole are assessed and the outcomes they get from these assessments. They're looking more for normal ranges on how the majority of students respond and learn. However, there are often results that lead to identification for individual differences, such as gender and levels of creativity. The next is academic problems with an emphasis in reading and math. Reading and math are the most highly occurring topics for research in educational psychology. While science and writing are also included, they often do not have the popularity of reading and math, often because of Western culture and how we see reading and math as the foundations for an education. Moreover, educational psychologists take a systematic approach with these articles and focus on teacher training methods to improve scores, not necessarily adjustments made for individual students. Cognitive processing is also a common topic in research for educational psychology. They often focus on attention, memory, transfer, and societal trends set forth to conduct research in the categorical classroom rather than the lab. This trend also has educational psychologists focusing on the practical implications of research being conducted, which leads to the next most recurring topic, which is teaching and learning. Teaching and learning often includes collaborative learning, argumentation, group discussion, and studying methods, all broad overarching topics focused on the classroom as a whole. Additionally, themes such as classroom goal structure, gender ratio, homeschooling, and gifted education are addressed. Again, the focus was primarily on the classroom as a whole and what methods teachers could initiate to help a majority of the student population. Next, let's talk about school psychology. The job description often involves assessment, consultation, referrals, and crisis intervention prevention. Bramlett et al. Discussed the current roles and responsibilities for school psychologists. In order to figure this out, they sent out a survey to 800 school psychologists in the National Association of School Psychologists. However, only 370 participants responded, which is roughly about 49%. Assessment was noted as the most common role for school psychologists, as over half of their time is spent conducting tests to help ascertain eligibility for students. The results of these assessments allow for special education services. However, because of the rules set forth by the IDEA, many school psychologists believe this role will be altered. Bramlett et al. Noted intervention based on the information gathered from these assessments is not accurate and therefore will need to be modified. The IDEA now requires functional behavior assessments be conducted with standards outlined by ABA. Hence, school psychologists will now have to be more involved in order for them to be more thorough. Consultation was the second most common role, and despite the increase of literature on this topic, there has not been an influx on time spent in this role. The most valuable information gained from this part of the survey was the data on the 4 stages of problem solving, which would be problem identification, problem analysis, plan implementation, and plan evaluation. The results stated most psychologists were not involved in the plan evaluation and relied on other methods to inform them of plan success. Again, in order to adhere to the IDEA amendments, this will need to be changed. Referrals were also a valuable component of the survey results. As indicated earlier, academic referrals are most common, and of those specifically reading problems. Written expression, mathematics, listening comprehension, and oral expression were also listed as common academic areas of concern, while task completion, conduct, motivation, defiance, peer relationships, truancy, and violence were amongst the behavioral problems. Of the behavioral problems, these were more common than depression, anxiety, withdrawal, and suicidal thoughts, which are referred to as internal issues. Special education categories such as mental retardation, autism, and traumatic brain injury were only a small percentage of referrals. Lastly, crisis intervention and prevention data were gathered as a result of the increase in crisis conditions happening worldwide in the school environment. Schools have seen an influx of delinquent youth, aggression including school violence specifically with weapons, death and suicide as a result of social media, as well as divorce, remarriage, and neglect. Often when these situations occur, school psychologists are seen as the first responders and begin to consult with students, parents, teachers, and community leaders to address these problems. Because of this overwhelming impact it has on schools, a large majority of responders indicated it is a vital and necessary role for school psychologists to be involved with crisis intervention and prevention. In summary, the majority of school psychologists' job description can be broken down into four major components: assessment, consultation, referrals, and crisis intervention. Other roles include conferencing, supervision, training, and research, all of which are less than 5% of the job as noted by the data. Ultimately, the results of this study in the vast majority of school psychologists' job focuses on individuals in the school and not the system itself.